reached the final installment of this series. I want to just begin with a couple thank yous. First of all, thank you to all of you and to the many people who have been coming. I think it's really been a tremendous experience of Torah, certainly for me personally, but I think for the group more broadly, and I really want to thank you for that. By extension of that, and I'll refer to this in a number of ways this evening, I want to thank the I think it was 36 of you who responded to the questionnaire that I sent out, which actually yielded a lot of just really interesting data, language, some of which I'm going to attempt to integrate. And I then want to thank, first of all, Kehilat Hadar, who has been a co-sponsor of this series and very much part of building the Beit Midrash and the conversation of Torah that we're trying to have here. Very grateful for that partnership. And a thank you to the Yeshivat Hadar fellows in general, who have done all sorts of things with arranging chairs and setting up the room, and otherwise, again, I said this at the beginning, anchoring this Beit Midrash as a place where these conversations can happen. And I have great gratitude to all of you and to all of them. Acharon Chaviv, the actual work of getting this set up week in and week out has fallen to Benji Stanley, a fellow this year in the yeshiva, who has just, with his diligence and professionalism and ever-present smile, been a great pleasure to work with. So thank you, Benji. Good. Well, we're going to begin sort of our way out with what I've titled here, Appropriating and Applying. And what I mean by that is, while we by no means covered all of Hilchot Niddah, not even remotely, we have seen a number of key issues and key topics. And one of the things that I'd like us to pivot to in our final time together is some thinking about what does it mean not just to suck up information on this topic and come out with more knowledge than we came in with, but to also start to move to the footing of what it means to appropriate this topic, to actually take ownership of it, not just to learn about it, and then to figure out how it does and does not apply to our contemporary lives, which I think is really always the final, that's the ultimate height of the journey into learning, is figuring out how you take that material and make it real. We're going to do that tonight. I'm going to begin by talking about an example that I think is a good example of what it means to appropriate and apply aspects of Hilchot Niddah. And then I'm going to once again call on my colleague Aviva Richmond to offer a couple bridging thoughts and responses to some of what I have laid out in the sources here that you have in front of you. And then I'm going to offer some concluding reflections in a little more of a just sort of lecture without Q&A and textual analysis piece at the end to bring us to conclusion. Okay? So, I began the first week by going through a number of motivations and explanations of Niddah, and you may recall I took a swipe at the apologists and gave you some of the explanations of what this is really about that I argued to you didn't really match the data of what the Torah or frankly even Chazal were talking about. And not only did they not match the data, but they seemed to try to hide some of that data, and were not really honest with what their theory would be about. So for instance, a theory of Niddah that's all about keeping a marriage healthy has a hard time explaining why Niddah is relevant outside of marriage, which indicates that it is something broader beyond that. And to the extent that one really is going with that, not just as an apology but as an explanation, one would want to think about ways in which the application of those halachot actually matched what one claimed was the core purpose behind it. Okay, I stand by that, but I want us to take an example tonight where I think apology, not as apology, but as appropriation, of sort of imagining what it means to use earlier frameworks to achieve different ends, can mean in a more positive, proactive way. And in particular, take one small example of what I will argue to you is the use of Hilchot Niddah in the context of rabbinic literature to do something very different than what Niddah actually is about, and to see the ways in which the commentators are engaging with that and trying to struggle with that uneven legacy. Okay? So we're going to begin by reading a sugya, which is going to lay out the case we're going to talk about, which is essentially a woman to whom marriage has been proposed, and whether the marriage can actually be formed, legalized, consummated. It's not totally clear exactly what it is, but the nisuin, the marriage, really take effect immediately. So if I can have a volunteer to jump right into page 1, the first source from Bavli Niddah, beginning with Rava's statement, and then the story that we'll see spun out around it. Please, Hannah.
Said Rava, if she was asked to be married and agreed, she must wait 7 days. Shiva Nihim. Ravina arranged his son's wedding at the house of Rav Hanina, a religious Saviva. Rav Hanina said to Ravina, does the master intend to write the ketubah for Wednesday? He said, yes. When Wednesday came, he waited until the following Wednesday, delaying 7 days after the original day. Rav Hanina said to him, what is this about? Ravina said, does not the master hold like the teaching of Rava? Rav Hanina answered, Rava indeed said what he said about an adult woman who sees blood, but when did he ever say anything about a minor who does not see blood? Ravina's son's bride was a minor. He said to him, Rava was explicit that there is no difference between adults and minors. Why does this rule apply to adults? Because she feels desire. The minor also feels desire.
All right, there's a lot of things going on in this text, a lot of assumptions and a lot of different elements. All right, but let's begin with the basic thing. Right? We start with a ruling by Rava that there is a 7-day waiting period. We'll leave Shiva Nikiyim now, not spelled out further than that, after a proposal is accepted. Okay? And then Rav Hanina and Ravina have a kind of back and forth of one of them not really thinking this tradition should apply, the other thinking it should. So far, I want to underscore to you, nothing has been said whatsoever about blood. All right? Just been told when someone accepts a proposal, must wait 7 days. Unless you think Shiva Nikiyim clearly means 7 blood-free days, which you'll recall I raised earlier the work done in Shai Sekunda's dissertation about problematizing that phrase actually originally meaning that. But the explicit conversation is not about blood, but about waiting, until it becomes revealed that the bride in question here seems to be she's prior to menarche. She has not yet menstruated. Okay? And that's a whole other piece here that we're not even getting into of the child marriage and all of that piece, right? We can come back to it, but it's not the core part of the story here, except in as much that what's the point? What does that introduce into the story that Rav Hanina thinks is relevant here, and what does it indicate about his assumption about Rava's ruling? Draw out the obvious here for us to be clear.
She can't have seen blood if she hasn't started having her period.
All right, so she won't have seen blood, and the assumption seems to be, what was Rava concerned about?
Blood.
About blood, and what is the final response in the story?
The blood, it seems to equate blood with desire in some way.
Okay, I think there's a causal claim here, right? That is to say, the feeling of desire is presumed to somehow lead to the appearance of blood. And once we posit that for an adult, that is to say, completely disconnected from normal menstruation, desire may trigger bleeding, then the final line seems to say, it's totally reasonable that the same emotion, body, mind, soul connection that leads desire to connect to blood in an adult who wouldn't otherwise expect it, could lead it to be present in a minor. And therefore, with the minor as well, 7 days must elapse. Okay, what do you make of this? What do you make of those data points? What is confusing? What seems to make sense about this? Let's draw it out a little bit before we go further. Yeah, please.
Well, how could anyone ever have sex if you thought desire meant that you bled? That doesn't really...
Okay, great. So if desire equals the contributing to blood, there's already an issue here of, well, we must be talking about some kind of more local definition of desire, because surely we wouldn't be prepared to say that anytime anyone feels some kind of sexual desire, like in the act of sex, we can assume that bleeding has happened, because then we'd have much bigger problems in terms of the conversation, right? Now, by the way, what michamda even means here, what the desire is and whether it is erotic or it's about something else, like specifically the desire to get married, is not spelled out, and something that's examined. But that's one thing, right? That's one issue. Other thoughts? Yes, Arya.
Are we sure it's not talking about like somebody just reaching puberty?
Okay,
Like,
so desire not in this moment,
yeah.
but meaning has had desire, is at the age of the beginnings of desire, a la Viva Zornberg, which is right about reaching sexual maturity, and therefore meaning. So how does that work with the minor, though? The person seems to be explicitly a minor.
Yeah, I don't
Not clear. Okay,
know. Well,
but
maybe there's like some people think desire only appears when you reach puberty, and some people think no. Like there's no latency stage.
Okay, so it might be possible that's not even actually talking about an event that happens now. You would, of course, then have to sort of understand, well, what's the 7 days about then, if we're not talking about a bleeding that happens now? The 7 days seems like it's responsive to something, or at least is taken as such. Okay, great. Yes, Nigel.
I don't know if this is possible, but you could conceive.
It apparently helps the folks at home, so
Yeah.
I appreciate
You
it.
you could conceivably read this as if it, in some way, it's almost disconnected from Niddah itself at all. In other words, you could conceivably read this as if there is beginning to be a presumption. I mean, I don't know if this is possible, but it's almost as if you could read it as if there is a presumption that you ought to wait 7 days after the marriage until consummating or reconsummating the marriage, regardless of blood to some extent.
Great, okay, so another way of taking this is that if we take, right, and this is really where I want to go, right? There's two ways of reading that statement at the end, right? One is the surface reading, which seems to be, this is a conversation about blood. And we are making a claim that blood is triggered by desire. And even in cases where there's no broader context of menstruation, it's also going to be triggered. And this is sort of a factual claim about that. By the way, that would lead us to raise a whole other question, which is, does that even have any relationship to reality? Right? That desire actually produces bleeding. Right? That's one way of reading it, which produces that. You'll see this played out in the Rishonim. There's any number of other things if you start digging down. Not at all clear that the procedure that's being followed here in terms of waiting time actually matches what we would normally assume would be the response in rabbinic discourse to actual sighting of blood. Which leads you effectively, intuitively, to a different kind of reading of that last line, which is in a way, though using the language of blood, essentially saying, we are dealing with something here that actually has nothing to do with blood whatsoever. In a way, we're using the language and framework of Niddah to do something that has nothing to do with Niddah. But clearly using that language. Now, exactly where to locate oneself between those two readings is now what we'll see. But I want you now to see the next passage as one inkling of one of the main consequences of taking this stance that one has to wait 7 days between proposal and marriage. Okay? So someone read me Yevamot, the next passage. This one is a very entertaining passage. Please, Al.
When Rav came to Dardashir, he announced, "Who wants to be with me for the day?" When Rav Nachman came to Shechan Tzir, he announced, "Who wants to be with me for the day?"
Then the Gemara asks,
Didn't Rabbah say if she was asked to be married and agreed, she must wait 7 days? The rabbis would send messengers ahead and inform the women that the rabbi was coming to town. Alternatively, the rabbis were merely setting aside these women as designated for them, but were not sexually intimate with them.
okay, that's a service no longer available in the Yellow Pages, but apparently at least posited as plausible that someone would go ahead. But what's the core, right? So you have two resolutions here, neither of which is particularly compelling on the facts of it, right? The notion of showing up and saying, who wants to be with me for the day, and you're actually choosing from a pre-selected pool of people who agreed 7 days beforehand that they might answer yes to that question if they showed up, right? Or the notion that the great drama about who wants to be with me for the day is just to potentially set up the possibility for an encounter later. Neither of those seem to fit with the plain sense of what Rav and Rav Nachman are doing, which seems to be much more like, I think it was in the New York Times, I think like a year and a half ago, it was like a whole article about one-day marriages in Islam. So you can go back and probably find it in the archives. A whole practice that has a deep history to it of what it means to have a kind of licensed marriage. In the yeshiva here, we recently had a shiur by Tzvi Zohar about what it means to imagine non-marital, committed, intimate relationships. This is saying, forget about it, have it be marriage. It just lasts for a day, and then you get the divorce in the morning, right? But what's going on here, right? Great, the answers are not plausible. What's the key interplay here between Rava and these stories? Yeah.
It gives a reason that has nothing to do with Niddah about why he would have said 7 days in order to. It seems like Rava's comment is designed to prevent this type of thing from happening, possibly cloaked in the idea of 7 days and using terminology for Niddah, but really just concerned with, trying to eliminate this custom of being married for a day.
All right, great. So that's the strong formulation. All right, the strong formulation is this source potentially gives us a window into, given the oddities in the first source, why might someone have said and used this framework of Niddah in order to achieve a 7-day waiting period? And one might be that there might be problems with elopements that are not about, right, you've been dating for 3 years and then you decide to get married without a caterer, but like a real elopement, okay? Right? Las Vegas, all right? That's what we're talking about here. We don't want what happens in Vegas to stay in Vegas. We want people to have a sense of that kind of sexual relationship is not built in a day, and this language is designed to do that. But even if you don't go that far, what I want you to know, which is what the Gemara picks up on, is that is surely one of the main consequences of holding Rava's position, right? One of the main consequences, whether intentional or not, and I think the intentionality is plausible, but one of the main consequences is you will put a different frame on what it means to begin a sexual relationship with a stranger, and even to begin a committed relationship with someone too quickly from the moment of proposal and agreement. All right? Now the language here is still very much one of Niddah. And we can talk about that more, but I want to see more material first of why would someone reach for Niddah as the powerful taboo distance language for effecting that in a way that perhaps might be more effective, or one could imagine might be more effective, than just saying, hey, you really should wait 7 days. That is to say, if you have something to tap into that goes to some of the things that at times in this conversation we've been disturbed by, of some of the languages of tum'ah, distance, etc. This is just an interesting case, I think, of what it means to actually take a category, apply it in a way that has real consequences, but in a way that actually is fundamentally, in certain ways, inconsistent with where it originally comes from. And now we'll see the details of that play out. Yeah.
It's hard for me to keep all the different sources, the technicalities in my head, but I'm wondering why
it's not necessarily plausible that the first source, Rava's point, would be to avoid a situation where the bride would be in a state of niddah on the wedding night.
So it is possible that that is a concern to the extent that, A, you really think she actually bled, for instance, even if she's a minor, right? 2, if the way you respond to that possibility of bleeding is more or less in keeping with the way you otherwise respond to niddah, which is an assumption we're about to problematize in the following sources. And then also there's the question of, I'm not actually sure that this is what that looks like. I think what it looks like to be nervous about the bride being in niddah is to be nervous about that because that could happen without prediction. Before people are on the pill, before people are able to completely pace that out, that's an unknown that may develop. And putting this 7-day waiting period based on the proposal is not going to do anything if 4 days later, there's actually a menstrual period. Right? Nothing in here is saying, oh, we just count from there, and then we don't worry. After that, it doesn't matter. Right? That would be interesting. That would sort of be setting up, this is going to be our way of taking that concern out of the wedding night. This doesn't seem to do that at all.
But is it
Unlikely to, since it specifically says Nikiim, couldn't that be read like after whatever menstruation might happen in the next 3 days, let's say? Then you wait for that to end, and then
Right.
you go through the whole rigmarole.
Good. So that's what we're going to see now. Does Nikiim really mean Nikiim here? And how can we detect whether it really means that or not? But I'll remind you also, I would expect if this teaching were targeted at the wedding, that we would not be talking about 7 days from the acceptance of the proposal, which is not at all necessarily clear that that is for sure 7 days before the wedding. There's nothing in this teaching that says, and then you better get married on day 7. You could get married a year later, it seems, according to this, just not within those first 7 days. And that seems to indicate that the timing is about something distancing it from the acceptance of the proposal, rather than about somehow trying to work out the timing of Niddah Zava issues around the wedding itself. All right, but now let's see, all right? Two of the things, and we're just going to look quickly basically at two examples of issues that would come up. There are two issues that would sort of put to the test whether you're actually talking about blood and whether you're actually talking about Niddah slash Zava or doing something else. One is, what if the woman, after receiving the proposal, checks herself and says, but I didn't bleed? If it's all about blood, that should be end of story. If not, then I would expect some way of worming around that fact if I want to still speak in the language of blood, even though there's no blood. That's one issue. The second issue is, well, wait a minute, Shiva Nikiim, the way it gets understood to be interpreted, as we saw in an earlier session, is the notion that I'm counting 7 days. I'm worried that the body needs 7 blood-free days to reset. Okay? So presumably, if I didn't actually count or check in any way, waiting 7 days would be a problem if I'm dealing with real response to blood. Whereas if this is not actually about blood at all, then who cares if there was a check? All I really care is that there was a 7-day cooling off waiting period, however you'll term it. Right? Those two legal questions, legal situations, and how you split on them are going to tell you a lot about what is this category really about. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm a little confused about this concept of the problematizing of desire.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if are we only problematizing it before the relationship, the physical relationship begins? Is that the only way in which it's problematic?
We seem to have to say that, in that it's almost hard to imagine, it's impossible to imagine that we would say anytime there's desire, there's blood, as was raised earlier.
Right.
If you wanted to really dig deeper on this, I didn't in the interest of time, there's a story only in Hebrew on the bottom of page 1 that does talk about dam chimud, the blood of desire, in the context of marriage, and there it dafka seems to be benign. Which is even weirder, right? That's a whole other problem with this text of what do you mean? They're the desire, when they say it's desired, it seems like, oh, that's blood you don't have to worry about. It's caused by desire, not by menstruation, not by other things we care about. Here, desire is creating distance. Another thing that makes the axis of blood seem very problematic is the key thing that's going on.
Right, I guess it's just really troubling to me to try to take desire and problematize it before a relationship even begins. I mean, I see the idea of, you want to like not just be like, oh, I want that, let's go for it, but I also think that like telling people not to trust desire is like A, never gonna work, and B, just like a kind of difficult thing to kind of then ask people to be like, don't desire something, now go marry it. Like, that seems like a poor
right. Okay, good. So
train.
I'm going to leave this. You have, I think, a thought or two on this, and I'm going to leave it for that next piece. It's a good point. Okay. Let's look at the Ravad, the Ravya, and a couple of these other sources here. So, the Ravad, okay? This is a long paragraph, but I'd like you just to read it through. It'll give you a sense of the basic issues, and then some of the others we may do even outside of the text. So on page 2, Ba'alei HaNefesh. And I have a reading volunteer. Lizzie.
The woman was offered marriage and accepted. Even if she checked herself and found no blood, she must wait 7 blood-free days after the proposal. And she must check herself during these 7 days and immerse on the 8th night, like all other cases of Niddah observed today, which follow the standards of Zavah. Why? Because she has desire in anticipation of the wedding, and perhaps a drop of blood the size of a mustard seed emerged and got lost. But there is one leniency with respect to this case as opposed to others. In other cases of the sighting of blood, a woman needs to check that she has stopped bleeding, but in the case of the proposal, even though she has not checked, she can count 7 days. This is proven from the story of Ravina. It is clear that from there that there was no check to verify the end of bleeding, since Rav Hanina did not think that there was any need to wait 7 days, and nonetheless the 7-day time was valid. Perhaps you were bothered by the fact that there was no checking during the 7 days, and it is impossible to have 7 blood-free days without checking. That presents no difficulty. We hold that a single check during the 7 days, whether at the beginning or the end, is sufficient. When Ravina finally came, the bride performed the check and then immersed. But there is no way to avoid the implication that a check to verify the end of bleeding is unnecessary.
All right, now this Rabbah is a great example of a text where you read it on its surface level, it's completely and totally absurd. You read it as an indicator of using one set of terms and one kind of language to talk about something different, and it makes complete and total sense. This notion that every time we suspect there might have been a drop the size of a mustard seed and it got lost, right? You can imagine what that would do if actually applied. Okay? That's an impossible standard to actually engage with. But what is the Ravad effectively saying there when he says that? I would argue to you. He's saying, this is not about blood in a language that is about blood. Right? He is talking about a conversation where the way we have described the 7-day waiting period is in the language of, there might be blood on account of desire, etc., and therefore there's a problem. And therefore, any way that we actually flesh out the details of that is going to have to engage with the language of blood. And yet, the Ravad is saying, I resist the notion that if you tell me there's no blood there, Rava is in the dustbin. Because on some level, the Ravad, and I can't tell you, is it consciously, subconsciously, but minimally subconsciously, understands there is something more to that teaching than just the concern of whether a certain fact pattern happened. There's a concern there about how proposals should be followed by sexual intimacy. And that is independent of whether the blood was actually discovered. That's where he sort of falls out on one side of this. Now, on the flip side, well, let me say, what also falls on the side of saying it's not about blood, and what he sort of points out to us, the story forces us to show, is this is a very unusual case of Niddah, if this is really about Niddah. Because Niddah normally requires some notion, forget about what the check is, but some consciousness of, okay, menstruation is over now. Okay? But this story, how does it play out? Rav Hanina, and it's not clear, is it his daughter or just he is somehow the supervising person where she lives, they have no idea that this 7-day waiting period is going on until Ravina shows up a week late. They never thought this applied at all. So obviously, she was not having any kind of mental check or physical check on the first Wednesday to make sure that she could start legitimately counting 7 blood-free days. So says the Ravad, yeah, I guess that rule must also not apply here, even though that would normally be like Niddah. On the other hand, he finds a way, albeit in a reduced level, to say, but wait a minute, if we're talking about blood, there must be some kind of check at some point. And the way he has to insert that into the story, since again you have this problem of they only find out retroactively, is when Ravina shows up, she quickly does a check which is sufficient to cover the basic requirement of 1 check in the 7 days. And then it's enough to immerse and to proceed. Yeah?
I don't know, it almost strikes me that it's not even really about the woman, but more like when you think about who is going to perhaps have some sort of emission as a result of desire, it's not the woman that you
Right.
think about, it's the man. And so we're talking about blood, and you have to wait 7 days, and you have to check, but whatever, not really. And it just seems that maybe it's like we're more concerned about the man, but there isn't this ritual associated with a man purifying himself before marriage. So we're sort of twisting this and putting it back on the woman.
I agree. Meaning that is, I think, a totally plausible reading. And this is why, by the way, when I say, I hope it's clear that when I say appropriating and applying and take this as an example, it's not because I don't think it's a fraught example. And this is sort of a great way of, oh, great, just like they did that, we do this. I hope you can sort of go on the intellectual journey sufficiently to understand it as a way of reimagining that we would do in some very different ways, but that, yes, is saying, how do I build, right, let me just sort of flesh out what you just said. If I wanted to build a culture where I tell men who I'm worried will be out of control going around, who wants to marry me for the day, right, to stop and to feel that there's sort of a real problem or a real block on doing this, how do I do that? I try to find some place where there is some taboo, some block, some framework that already has some traction to it. And in this case, quite possibly, I'm reversing the actual object of concern here in order to make that happen, right? This is not entirely different from, the way one of my high school teachers articulated why you shouldn't eat tuna fish in like a non-kosher restaurant was not through the language of, here's what it means to go into a neutral space that's not really a Jewish space, to go out into the broader world, to kind of blend boundaries, to be in that kind of public culture in a way that might be risky, etc. It was, these are the 12 ways that tuna fish could actually have been treif. Right? And part of what that's tapping into is the feeling of, well, let's have a sophisticated conversation about boundaries is much less effective than saying, you might eat pig! Right? Which everyone's like, oh my God, I wouldn't want to eat pig even if I love sitting around and having lunch with Gentiles, right? So, but this I think is not entirely dissimilar, even if it's problematic, as that case is problematic, for the ways in which sometimes halachic language and practice uses older forms or marshals the services of older forms to accomplish new ends. And that's part of what I want us to see. Now, if you look forward here, the Ravya, I'll let you see it inside on your own because I want to really wrap up this section. But the Ravya goes the other way. And he says, he concludes, which you can see there on the bottom of page 2, if a woman checks herself on the day of the proposal and finds no blood, then it's fine. Get married. Meaning he takes quite seriously that it's about blood, and therefore blood is not present. He throws the concern out the window. The Torah Habayit on page 3 goes all the way in the other direction, and in a sense I think really gets in its purest form that this has nothing to do with blood whatsoever. If you see here on page 3, it says, it seems that she requires neither a check to verify the cessation of bleeding, nor any checks during the 7 days, neither at the beginning nor at the end. As long as she waits 7 days after the proposal, she can immerse in his Torah. Sheharei zo lo ra'ata klal. This woman didn't see any blood. You might be using a language of maybe she saw it, but she didn't. You don't actually have any evidence that she saw it. The whole reason Rabbi has to say this is, oh, if you propose, I'm telling you, you have a formal rule as if she saw blood. But the Rashba basically says, but she didn't. And therefore, the rules of that ought not to apply. Which then he's scared to actually say at the end, because too many of his teachers said the opposite. Right? But the Beit Yosef correctly presents him as his position is, this is not about blood at all. And therefore, checking, right, lechumra and lekula, checking does not help you, and checking is unnecessary, because it's not about blood. Yeah?
That sort of leads me to 2 parts to the question. First of all, my first question is that here, by the time you get to these sources, there's obviously a going to the mikvah after the waiting, but in the sources in the Gemara, is that implied or not necessarily?
I thought that too when I was reading this, and I don't know. I would say this. To the extent that it starts to become about blood, it's not easily imaginable to me that in the world of Chazal, they would be able to use that paradigm and throw out the mikvah piece. However, this of course gets us down a whole other rabbit hole of problems, which is, if this is really about effectively using a paradigm that's out there, and there were clearly no checks going on, does this source actually serve as evidence of a notion that maybe checks are not really needed in the context of intimacy, even if they're needed in the context of taharot, which I will refer to before the evening is over. Yeah,
Okay.
second question.
Well, that mostly because the second source of the Yevamot source, it seems unlikely. I mean, it's a ridiculous story, but you can't imagine all these women going to the mikvah on the chance they might get married the next day, because that's not how you use that.
Right.
I think.
I think you're right, and right. No, I agree. And when I first, learned that source, I really wondered how much is that an interesting source for the notion of the mikvah not being some assumed thing, or what is also possible, but I'm not saying it's unproblematic, but is possible is two things. One, that maybe these women are still observing enough of the world of taharot that they're going to the mikvah anyway, because of trumot and other kinds of things, which we know still applied in Bavel. We know there's people eating truma in Bavel, and they are immersing. And it's possible that it's not that he assumes they went to the mikvah for them, but it's assumed that women, even unmarried, are going to the mikvah. It's not impossible. I agree with you. Your eye roll is not out of place, but it's also not impossible. The other piece is whether it's not that, oh yeah, there's no problem with the mikvah, but whether there's a sort of out of sight, out of mind of whether I actually need to verify that.
Okay, because then if it's not, if the source we just saw, if we think it's leaning towards it not really being about blood, then why would you have to go to the mikvah?
No, you're right. It's still, right, so good. And that's a good way of ending that source is, even the Rashba, who says it's not about blood, not about blood, not about blood, is still stuck with the basic language of blood, which in his world, there's no way that that leads you to a place other than Tevilah, right? But you're right. You're right that it's still, that's sort of still the residue of that. Yeah.
Just for a contemporary version of that, it's not about blood position. We got married in Texas, and the law there is that your marriage license doesn't take effect for 72 hours. And there's actually a 3-day kind of cooling off period, which seems like that's almost exactly what you're expressing here with one stream of the sources.
Right, and interestingly enough, one of the things that may be different is where you have the long arm of the law, like perhaps you do in Texas, you are able to actually just say that and enforce it. Whereas if you are more powerless, stateless in all the ways that these sources are, you may need to rely on much more deep-seated cultural assumptions and taboos in order to get the same mileage out of it. Great. All right, so the last thing here, and then I'm going to pause and hand it over, is the Pitrei Tshuva, I think, is sort of the ultimate culmination of this. It just cites two Tshuvot here on page 3. Givat Shaul, even if the woman is postmenopausal, she has to wait 7 days. And he makes an argument. He's like, well, they said it about a minor, so they would say it about menopausal. But of course, that's actually less, that doesn't really follow, because the minor might be having early menarche. Postmenopausal woman's basically done, right? It's not plausible. It's impossible for a woman to bleed again and to think she was postmenopause, but not really. But it's not actually a kal vachomer that's so obvious. There, I think you're also seeing someone who's saying, this isn't really about whether it's likely to have blood. And then in some ways, the most extreme, this Mekom Shmuel, a woman who becomes pregnant out of wedlock. All right? The desire definitely happened already. Okay? And they then persuade her lover to marry her when she's already 6 months pregnant. And the question is, well, wait a minute, does she need Shiva Nekiyim? Or she's pregnant. Like, she's unlikely to see blood. And she's not going to see blood on account of desire. I mean, for God's sake, she's pregnant with the guy's kid. No. Obvious, she must wait 7 blood-free days. Right? Now, cases like that, you can always say, no, they admit they don't really apply there, but just so you maintain consistency they're maintaining it, but I think there's something else going on there, which is this is a real understanding on the part of these Meshivim that this is not about what the language seems to indicate it's about. It's an appropriation of that language for something else, and therefore rulings that on the surface are absurd in the sense of to the extent you think they're about facts, the questioners are right to raise them as outliers, as an application of a different policy may actually be not just reasonable, but sort of the necessary conclusion that one would reach. Okay, I'm going to turn over to the podium for a couple comments, responses for the next piece.
I just want to again say thank you and sort of honored and excited to be part of this conversation. So what I want to do is first support some of the things that have been said already about looking at this case of Dam Chimud as a model of a discussion that's centered around the language of blood and a regime of 7 days of waiting, but seems to not actually be about blood and instead about mediating a transition into marriage. And what I want to say to support that is, right, we also see examples in later halachic literature. There's some of like the most exciting and dramatic soap opera-like sources you get to look at come up in relation to Dam Chimud. There's all these discussions of marriage deliberations that are shaky, right? Maybe there's a marriage that's suddenly postponed for a couple days as they're still working out the finances or other parts of the agreement for the marriage. Does there have to be a new 7 days, right, after the marriage has been postponed? Or what if there's a sudden switch in who the husband will be in the marriage, right? So the woman has already been expecting to have sex, maybe there's already been desire. Does there have to be a new 7 days once there's a new man involved? So there's some exciting cases around here, and what I want to stress is that those positions that say, yes, there has to be a new period of 7 days, right, another period of 7 days in these kinds of situations, I think draw our attention to the fact that these are scenarios where the deliberations are kind of uncertain. And there's an idea there that maybe you need to wait for stability before the marriage can be consummated. Especially, right, if we think that maybe a couple is expecting to get married, suddenly the deliberations are shaky. Maybe they'll think the marriage will be called off and they won't get to have sex at all. So maybe that would even create more likelihood for there to be a little sexual encounter before marriage that is important to prevent, so that there's not pregnancy in case the marriage goes awry. So I just want to support that, that analysis of Dam Chimud as a way of preventing rash marriages. But I also want to sort of push this conversation towards a broader conversation about sexuality, the way it might intersect with a broader conversation about sexuality, and in that also push our focus to the fact that this delay mechanism of the rash marriage does center around the woman's body. So far we've been talking about maybe shifting a male perspective towards impetuous sexual intercourse. And I think if we focus for a minute on the fact that this centers around women's bodies and a language of female desire, we might find that it could intersect with our notion of what it means to give consent, and specifically for a woman to give consent to be in a sexual relationship, and B, what it might say about a woman's relationship to her own sexual body, particularly before being in a sexual relationship with a man. So what do I mean? Right, number one, right, let's be a little bit more sensitive to the power dynamics involved in the sexual relationships that are being described. So for example, when we have that statement of Rava, Tavolina say Vinit Paisa, right, how do we imagine the dynamics of that interaction, right? He claims her to be married and she is appeased, literally. So I think in some ways, right, if we look at Dam Chimud as saying there has to be a 7-day period before this marriage can occur, it might be problematizing our notion of nit paisa and consent, right? Does that initial nit paisa being appeased, maybe submitting to his seduction, one could maybe formulate it that way, is that the same as consenting to being in the relationship? Right? Maybe this idea of dam chimur and 7 days is to allow a woman to consider, right, to give actually a period of consideration before committing to the relationship, so that consent can be verified. And to support that, right, if you look at the Ra'aviyah, who talked about the case of what if she checks and there's no blood? And the Ra'aviyah says, actually, if she says, Bari li v'gam badakti v'lo ra'iti, I am certain, I checked, I didn't see blood, right? Could we maybe read that Bari li as not just a statement about not seeing blood, but also Bari li, I'm certain, as a sort of a statement of consent about wanting to be in the relationship, potentially. I bring this in not because I necessarily think that's what the Ra'aviyah intended, but I think as we try to open up the conversation of language in Niddah and appropriating it / reapplying it, we might have to also consider the ways that we're open to redefining phrases we see. And I think that's one example, right? Barili, not just about blood, but about a verbal statement of being ready to be in the relationship. Okay, right, I just will add one more thing about that. There's an interesting comment in the Taz, right, a gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, where he raises the cases of Yehuda and Tamar and Ruth and Boaz, right, biblical cases where women seduce men, as it were, and there's not a 7-day waiting period, right? So obviously this is somewhat anachronistic to apply this model to Tanakh, but in some ways, right, you can see in those situations, the power dynamics is sort of shifted. There you have a woman initiating the relationship, and in that situation, he sort of formally describes why there isn't a need for Shiva and Kiyim, right? So I say that also to draw our attention to power dynamics in the relationship and what it means for, right, women to give consent to have sex, and maybe even with the Taz, what it means for women to initiate the relationship and how that might shift the picture. Okay, now the second thing I want to talk about is, right, what might these sources say about a woman's relationship to her own sexual body or self before starting into a relationship of sexual intercourse with a man? And what I want to do to start that conversation is to say that there's an issue that we haven't talked about yet, which is time frame. When do these 7 days happen? Right, so it's clear in the Gemara that 7 days start from Tavua, from the day that, whatever that means exactly, that the proposal was accepted. Right? Now what you see in some later Rishonim, including the Tosafos and others, is that this 7-day period should actually be as close as possible to Bilat Mitzvah, to the actual consummation of the marriage. And the Rashba says it should be from the time where they start preparing for the chuppah. And I think you could explain that along the lines that we've been talking about. Maybe it's in that period just before marriage that the couple is more likely to sort of just preemptively have sex because they're going to be married anyway. Maybe that's when a man might be able to convince a woman more that it's okay to have sex because they're about to be married. And then how much worse if she becomes pregnant and the marriage actually doesn't happen. You could read that timeline that way. But I wonder if we could also read that time frame as Dam Chimud, these 7 days, being a sort of preparation for sex. Right? So that it's not only about well-considered consent that leads up to the sexual relationship, but maybe there's also something here about women preparing themselves for having sex, for that moment of consummating the marriage. And I think the strongest support for this you can see in the Ra'avad and the Rosh, where you see them talking about bidikot, even though there's not really a concern about blood. I don't know that we went into this, but they say there's no need for a hefsek tahara. There's no need for a deeply internal examination that generally is done at the end of the 7 days, or at the end of bleeding before beginning to count 7 days. Right? That deep internal examination is not done to establish bleeding has ended. Doesn't need to be done. There's been no blood. but there does need to be bidikot. And I think if you look at the different factors involved, right, what is the picture here? We have a woman about to get married. There's some recognition that she has a lot of desire, right? And then, right, there's this process of bidikot that aren't about blood, right? So touching the body, touching the vagina, not about blood in a time where she has desire and is preparing for sex, right? What could that be about? Could that be some kind of mechanism for a woman either gaining more familiarity with her body, if you imagine a virgin, somebody who has not been sexually active before marriage? Could that be about stretching the body? Could that, right, what is this experience like potentially for the woman? What could it be like? Again, female desire bidikot that aren't about blood. So I think I remember this. Okay, good. So I understand that this is potentially, somewhat speculative, but I think we have to be open to exploring possibilities of approaching these texts that are about women's bodies and try to see what they could mean from the perspective of women experiencing these processes that are described. So the final thing I want to say relates to the question of female desire, which I touched on a little bit in terms of power dynamics in the relationship and maybe a relationship that's initiated by women. I do want to say, right, we see in the Khatam Sofer a case about marriage or courtship via correspondence. Right, this couple has been writing letters back and forth, and the question is raised: well, when the husband or the groom arrives for the marriage, does there have to be a new waiting period of 7 days? But now she sees him. Maybe when she sees him, that will sort of kindle a new kind of desire. So there should be a 7-day waiting period. And his response is no. There doesn't need to be, because this desire that we're talking about of sort of an unknown, this desire for an unknown, anticipating a relationship with an unknown man, and the desire won't shift considerably when she sees him in person. So I mean that case is sort of an interesting case in general and what it might say about female desire and how it operates. But I think it's also relevant for the questions that have come up of, well, why is this desire different than desire in the marriage? Right? Maybe it would be impossible to have sex if we really took seriously that there's bleeding whenever there's desire. So that doesn't seem to be true, and I think his tshuva is one great example. But there's a certain desire that's being talked about desire for unknown encounter with an unknown man. Okay, so and the final thing I want to say in terms of the female desire component is right, the sources are described as reacting to female desire that exists. And my question is, right, if we look at this in some ways as perhaps part of a mechanism of preparing for sex and a sexual relationship, is there any way that we could look at the discussion of desire here not as a reaction to desire, but as a mechanism for constructing desire in relationship? And specifically, right, if we look at this as one model for 7 days of 7 clean days that aren't actually about blood, and reinterpreting what that could be about, right, can we apply that to other 7 clean days, right, that occur more regularly in the relationship? And could we view those days as being days to prepare to have sex? And if so, then how does desire figure into that conversation? Could those be days about constructing some kind of desire in the relationship? And in reference, I think, also to the discussion of harchakot that we had last week, where we focused on sensible boundaries, could we also view that this process of 7 days before sex as a way to be sensitive towards creating desire, creating a sense of the erotic in sexual relationships? Right? Is this framework and language useful for that conversation? Thank you.
Well, let's take a round of questions, responses, pieces here, and then after that, I'll take it home with some synthetic thoughts. But things that have been raised from, this conversation, specifically issues raised by Viva or pieces in the sources that we looked at.
Just wait till we get to you with the mic if possible. Thanks.
I'm really interested in what what Rava was saying about desire. I think I don't, on the one hand, I see totally the need or desire, if you will, to create a period of anticipation and building desire and preparation for sex. But I think that the problem that I have with it is when it runs into the effects of the way body chemistry actually works around menstruation. You have actually, during 7 days that they're talking about, actually that's often the peak of the woman's kind of hormones for the month, likely to coincide with the peak of her desire, which is clearly something that they had no knowledge of and were not at least intentionally interacting with. But it makes it a little bit harder for me to be like, well, this is really about creating desire, when you can kind of know either from personal experience or from biology class that that's not the way that desire functions. And I mean, and that 7-day waiting period is obviously one example, but the whole way that female desire, I think, is conceived of in all of these texts really is so far from the biological, actual female desire that it makes it, I find it to be a really fascinating conversation, but I think that I ultimately can't see it as in any way useful because it's so unrelated to that. None of these men can be, that the people writing these texts can actually be ignorant of the idea of lubrication in sex. That's something that they must have personal knowledge of, but somehow that's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about blood, as if blood is desire. And they must know that in their house, when their woman wants to have sex with them, it's not blood that's happening. So I think that that kind of whole weird cast of things that's going on makes the kind of other discussion about how we might see desire to be difficult for me to really engage with.
Let's take a couple. Yeah, Rachel.
Thank you. I thought that what you had to say was very interesting. I would have found it more compelling, though, were there any female voices in this conversation that you're drawing on, because you had some interesting points, but the way it seems to me now is just a bunch of men creating a framework about the way women feel or the way they think women feel, and it just seems paternalistic and based on sort of, I don't know whether these were your cultural assumptions coming out or what you were reading into them, but sort of men always being ready to go, women not understanding their bodies, maybe they don't know what sex is and so need to find that out, and the fact that having sex for the first time is a big deal for a woman, whereas for a man it's not. So I just find that to be in some ways more problematic the way you're reading it, even though I don't want to.
Maybe one more. Any other comment? Yeah.
I'm familiar with the custom before marriage of the bride and groom not seeing each other for 7 days. And I'm not sure if that custom is a reincarnation of the Shiva Nikim, but it seems to serve all of the same purposes we've just discussed about keeping the couple away from each other, so that they can avoid pregnancy, so that, for all the obvious reasons, they can obviously use that time to learn about sex. I think in today's world, women are using that time to, go to the mikveh before the wedding ceremony and do whatever else needs to get done. And it seems to me that if we have, I don't know if that custom was also taking place in the day where this 7-day waiting period was prescribed, but I didn't know what people thought about. I didn't know what you guys thought about that, or what that has to do with it. And it does seem to me, I'm not convinced. I'm more convinced that this particular waiting period was to ensure that proper Badika and immersion could be effectuated before a marriage, just since that's how it's done.
Sure. Okay, so I think there's an element of these two questions from Rachel and Tamar that overlaps in some ways, which is why do we even bother kind of dealing with sources that clearly don't include women's voices, and sort of try to see how they might relate to women's experiences. And I would say, I mean, yeah, maybe you're right. I'm sort of here to push the experiment of, what happens when we're sort of now literate and in this conversation. What does it look like, and how can meanings potentially shift? And I think in Dumpling itself, especially as you saw in the Gemara, there's at least one source that we didn't get to very much that was alluded to on the bottom of your first page, where it does seem like there is something about Dumpling that's actually about dam, that's about blood. And even so, the conversation seems to shift into something that's clearly not about blood, right? So I think like that model of shifting meaning or shifting application of language and concept, I think partly what I'm trying to do is ask, well, how far can that go? And in terms of, how it does or doesn't map out onto actual women's experiences of desire, which there have been studies about this, and it's different for different women, but obviously for some women, the 5 + 7 days doesn't work at all for having sex at the peak of desire. I guess my question is, this is in a more open-ended relationship to these texts, right? Still, is there something here about ways of constructing desire in a relationship more generally? And, right, in cases where the specific application of 5 and 7 days doesn't work out, right, might we then kind of shift the discussion a little bit and draw on other sources that might allow for reapplication for ways that honor women's experiences more? So I guess I don't mean this as, let's keep everything in place and sort of say it means something different. What I mean to do is say, well, how does this actually relate to experience, and then how might that shift our application of halacha as well, possibly by drawing on other halachic sources to be included in a conversation about sexuality. Or maybe this corpus of Niddah isn't enough for us to have those conversations we need to have about sexuality, but is this some sort of starting place?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just think that's great. Like, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that like the standard of where it is right now seems to be where the texts leave it seems to be insufficient for really dealing with female desire. I think it's like facing in that direction and then kind of is like, I can't do that. And I respect that. I mean, I think that's what's going on here, and that's the reality, and it's interesting still, if not totally satisfactory to me. But I don't think that it's like, I'm not so disappointed in it that I'm throwing up my hands and walking away. I just feel like it doesn't, like, it gets to a place where you have to be like, we're going to have to take a serious creative merit or authority here if we're going to want to continue the conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing in terms of that this is all about, right, inscribing a sense where sexuality for the first time for women is problematic, but for men, they're like sort of always ready to go. I think in the first parak of two books, you see that there's quite a bit of anxiety about male performance in sex for the first time. So again, right, we're looking at a limited corpus here. So I just wouldn't necessarily jump to conclusions about the assumptions that are being made about male versus female relationship to sexuality and the first sexual encounter.
I would just say, I think your suggestion about, I never thought about that overlap between the custom and what may be going on here, and I think it's very interesting. So yeah, take maybe like 2 more comments, and then I want to try to take us to the end. Yeah.
Sorry, I'd rather not be on the microphone.
Yeah, fine.
Just to shift, I just want to touch about, in general, seeing the 7 days reminder as something totally different, separate from blood. How do you then deal with the fact that for women who are menstruating, it is about blood, like the 7 days before getting married, and the waiting, and the bidikot, and I've said tarab, and going to the mikveh, that does have to do with her last menstruation. So I understand why we wouldn't just project it onto a minor, but it seems like we're going to a lot of, we're taking a lot of steps to look at something that for an adult woman is meant to be about blood, and for, if I'm not mistaken, and for a minor, that it's not about blood.
So I think it's not actually clear to me, meaning what you're describing is accurate of what practice looks like today.
Right.
Where people say, before you get married, okay, find what the last menstrual period was, and then that's the first time in your life, if you're getting married for the first time and you never went to the mikveh before, and you now do the checks, et cetera, and you lead up to the marriage. And it's not actually an application of this halacha at all, in part because this halacha is assumed to already have kicked in when you were finalizing the invitation for the wedding. Way before that time. Therefore, this was dealt with because we live in a culture that, right, our problem is how do we get people not to be engaged for 2 years, not how do we get them to be engaged for a day, right? So we, at some level, like, the non-blood aspects of this halacha are completely obsolete in our marital culture. And as a result, all that remains is this window of, figuring out how do I time Niddah, etc. But I'm not actually at all sure that, I'm pretty sure not, but that's not what's going on here. And part of what's going on is, in fact, a separate concern of, yeah, people might show up and asking who's going to be with me for a day. And there, a whole other thing, okay, she's not menstruating, Niddah would have nothing to say about that. Whereas this will then in that space. So I actually think that's another example where the assumption of the mapping of this onto what we do today from a different angle than the example you gave is not a perfect match.
What about the first Gemara that we looked at with Niddah? So like when Rabbi said it's explicit that it does apply to adult women?
Yeah, it applies to adult women, but the question is, no, what it says is it's explicit that it applies to either. Rav Chaviva is the one who says, wait a minute, my understanding is this category is all about blood, therefore it shouldn't apply to minors. To which the response is, blood's relevant for minors also. But what we problematized was, is it really saying blood is relevant for minors, or is it actually saying your assumption is not necessarily wrong? We'll give you the last comment on this round. Yeah.
I guess one of the things I've been struggling with is that when we're talking about women, we keep trying to put women's desires into, we keep putting women's desires into this equation, which I think is a respectable goal. But in Judaism in general, isn't there always a balance between law and desire, especially with sexuality? And so I think in some ways we're taking it to the complete extreme and saying, well, there's no women's voices here. It must be completely, like, you're ignoring women's desires completely. But maybe it's the reality that, like, in some cases, you don't have sex when it's like your highest, libido or desire will peak. That there's sort of another interplay here, maybe not as explicit, but the same way that men would have this interplay between law and desire, so too for women. Why are we taking it to the complete extreme and saying, no, bidikot must be about touching yourself? Maybe there's this middle ground there.
You can leave it as a floating comment.
I don't mean to be saying, right, female desire should be the most important thing on the table at all. I do think that, right, just like for men, for women also, there is, right, female desire is the beginning of a conversation of sort of how do we deal with female desire and sexual desire. So I guess it seems like that's one thing to be balanced in the picture. So I think it's important not to ignore it entirely, but to bring it into the picture, and I think this could be one way to bring it in.
All right, so let me, thank you, offer some closing thoughts here, not just on tonight, but on the 6 sessions we've been through. We've seen a lot of sources. There's a lot we have not addressed and we've not seen. Many of you here have generously shared, both here and on the questionnaire that I sent out, your insights and thoughts, and I want to just really emphasize the ways in which your thinking and approach to this has very much shaped my understanding of this topic. I've always left this room with a feeling of frustration on the one hand that we have not dug even deeper into some of the things that we've raised, but also energized by bringing the topic here more squarely into the light of day. So I want to end with a review of some of what we've seen, a little bit of a distillation of what you contributed through that questionnaire, and an articulation of my sense of the range of potential pathways forward. So I want to remind ourselves of a selection of the things that I began with as motivations that I think still have the potential to speak to us today, and they're thus potential grounding for our ongoing embrace of this practice as being filled with purpose and meaning. First, we talked about issues related to disgust, fear, and danger. Those were the most remote from our world, the ones that created the most difficulty and the most block, and I'll return to that in a minute. But I raised the notion that we might need to engage with a reality in which a significant proportion of men and women, not necessarily in the same proportions, might, whether we like it or not, have visceral reactions against having sex in the context of bleeding. And on the questionnaire, it was interesting, it emerged that this concern remains alive for a number of men and women today. And once that's the case, you have to then grapple with the reality that the culture of healthy sex may suffer if it is allowed to proceed at times that potentially trigger those gut reactions. Abstention from sex during menstruation might then be a tool in promoting a healthy relationship to sex at all other times, even if that comes at a cost to those who have no such visceral reactions themselves. Second, we spoke about bodily vulnerability, the connection in at least one source of menstrual sex to rape, and the general concern regarding pain and discomfort while having sex during this time that some women experience. The ban on sex during bleeding would thus aim to respect a woman's bodily vulnerability during this time and to protect her from the unwanted advances of a man, particularly in a culture in which female consent was not necessarily viewed as a prerequisite for sex. Many of you spoke in your responses about the power of Niddah to create a protected female space for the individual, a space in which biology is marked and honored, and when expected physical relationships with others take a back stage. Third, we talked about maintaining some basic link between sex and procreation, such that even if sex is permitted during non-fertile times, the act of having sex during a time when the body is sending a basic sign that the prior cycle's window of possible fertilization has closed may go too far in separating sex from its procreative powers. Fourth, we spoke about Jacob Milgram's articulation of the power of the tum'ah discussed in Vayikra 15, that the loss of menstrual blood and semen represent the loss of life, and marking them as tmeim is a way of affirming a broader culture of life as the focus of God and as the focus of our lives. There's always a risk that you can turn into a culture that venerates death, and to think that God desires death and an escape from this world. The system of tum'ah, according to Milgram, is an unequivocal way of separating holiness from death. The ban on sex during menstruation for this view is simply, do not pursue the ultimate life-creating activity in the context of a bodily sign that evokes death, albeit cyclical and in potentio, emerging from the life-creating part of the body. And the closing ritual of immersion in a mikvah, which formally moves the body from the world of tum'ah to the world of tahara, remains a powerful marker for many of you that you spoke about, a true experience of rebirth. And finally, we talked about the ways in which Niddah has been applied, even if not always in total lockstep with some of those initial motivations, in ways that contribute socially and spiritually, particularly in a time in which Niddah is observed almost entirely in the context of monogamous commitment. And many of you spoke about the striving for kedusha in sex that seems to underlie the practice of marital Niddah. And you talked about the ways in which, much like restrictions related to Shabbat, to letting the land lie fallow in Shemitah, to eating through the discipline of kashrut, this practice attempts to acquire holiness by enforcing boundaries. and the practice of regular abstinence continues for many to be a powerful spiritual practice in elevating sex at permitted times to a higher plane. Niddah also, for a number of you, is an opportunity to work on the non-sexual elements of a relationship, to recharge sexual drive, and to otherwise maintain balance in intimate settings. And to my mind, those are all powerful motivations that retain significant force even today, and are able to help explain the severe karet penalty that manifests itself in this sexual prohibition, as it does in almost all sexual prohibitions, since sex is the basic life-giving engine of our culture, and its mistreatment or misuse potentially threatens the entire society. But you don't have to ponder long to begin to feel the ways in which the simple application of much of what we have seen to contemporary reality carries with it major problems. First, what does it mean to project concerns of disgust onto a natural process of women's bodies, particularly in an age when almost any public marker of menstruation has been effaced? Doesn't that risk leaving us just with the stigmatization of women's bodies without even having any experiential data on which it hangs? And doesn't that threaten to morph into a theory of revulsion from the female body, potentially internalized by both men and women, that can undermine the very healthy culture of sex that a sensitivity to disgust might be intending to support? You might also add that the dramatic increase in the number of menstrual periods that women today experience in a lifetime, in contrast to earlier times, actually makes any marking of menstruation today much more inextricably linked with female identity than it might have been in the past, when due to poorer health, earlier marriage, lack of birth control, menstruation would have been more tightly associated with certain transitional times in life. Second, what happens when the concern for bodily vulnerability becomes enveloped in a regime of a total ban on touch, a ban that actually threatens to make women feel rejected during menstruation as opposed to honored and respected? Third, how do you even begin to see Niddah as related to fertility in a world in which so many women take drugs before they are married, and in many cases not long after men are, in order to completely detach sexual processes from procreation? And even if you want to maintain that connection, why is a 7 or 12-day waiting period the way to tap into that, as opposed to the dominant medical paradigms that talk about ovulation and other bodily processes that are largely hidden from view? Fourth, what are the consequences of making death and menstruation associated, one with the other, for our understanding of the female body, particularly, again, in a time when menstruation occurs so much more frequently? And how do you translate that feeling into a world in which menstruation is so hidden and shielded from public view, and so, in Western society, generally uninhibiting of full female participation in almost all aspects of life? And even more to the point, is it possible to sustain an enthusiastic connection to the ban on menstrual sex in a world in which the other aspects of Tum'ah and Tahara have largely disappeared? Menstrual blood is not accorded the status of Tume'ah in any other area of religious practice. Doesn't the ban on menstrual sex become a taboo with no anchor, one that just threatens to be self-referential and devoid of any meaning other than submission to the law? And then, even more directly, as expressed in many of your comments, what do we do with certain core aspects of these mitzvot and their treatment over time that seem at odds with many of the things that we hold dear? Foremost among them, how do we deal with the near total absence of female voices in a conversation heavily focused on women's bodies, and a deep suspicion to rejection articulated by many of you of any conversation about menstruation that focuses overly on revulsion and disgust? Now, before getting to a couple of highlights of ways in which I think we can bridge that gap in the halachic conversation, I think it's important to acknowledge a key point. It's not possible within biblical and rabbinic conversation to assert that menstrual blood is tahor, or more broadly, to claim that Vayikra 15 sees a possible confluence of Niddah and public sacred space, or that Vayikra 18 views sex during menstruation as something positive to be pursued. You can neutralize those texts, partly or wholly, such that they're applied very differently. And it's also possible to draw on other halachic categories that emphasize the importance on having sex at a time when both partners are most receptive to it. But it's unrealistic in this area, as in many others, to imagine that we can expect what the Torah says to be a perfect projection of what a close analysis of our experience would produce. Our spiritual journey with halacha should be one in which our instincts are challenged and one in which the realities of our lives redirect our time-bound application of those texts. But that does not mean that a prolonged period of meditation and reflection by each one of us would produce the Torah or its rabbinic interpretation. One of my teachers who I was discussing this had the following to say: when teaching Niddah, I don't think you can get anywhere if the goal is to get people to convince themselves that sexual abstinence is a so much more meaningful way of marking the event of menstruation than, for instance, eating ice cream, such that they would impose it on themselves if the Torah hadn't already suggested. His point being, some might, right? But if someone who would never generate that, there's no sense in saying that somehow the goal of the conversation has to be to get to the point where that would necessarily be generated. What you may be able to do, he continued, is to say that granted that the Torah expressed that there's an obligation to connect menstruation and abstinence, and given that mitzvot should be pathways to joy and meaning, how do we best fulfill that responsibility? And another striking point on the questionnaire was the point expressed by many that one of the most compelling elements of Niddah was the possibility of locating sex in a framework transcendent of self, whether in relationship to one's partner, past centuries of practice, the Torah, or God. And that, I would argue, is the reason that people in the 21st century continue to bother to be a part of this project of Jewish observance at all. If you are looking for the most restful, contemplative, laid-back tradition, don't choose Judaism. If you are looking to construct a document that most powerfully captures contemporary feminist critiques of law and society, you would never write the Torah as we have it. And if you wanted a religious conversation that truly afforded the most space for the opinions of both men and women, you would certainly not choose the Torah Shebe'al Peh. In fact, you would start over. But most of us are in this room because we don't want to start over. Even as the millennia-old nature of Judaism can frustrate and distance at times, it's actually that chronological transcendence that's precisely one of its most compelling elements. And I think it's fair to say that most of us in this conversation in the past 6 weeks want to apply the Torah and our best understanding of God's word to our contemporary reality, and to do it in a way that's maximally consistent with the stories and practices of our ancestors. It's in that space where we stand in a heteronymous realm of covenant and then assert our need and responsibility for a Torah that makes sense in our lives, that the real conversation begins. Now, in that space, I don't think the challenges are the same for all of us. For some of us, the motivations for almost all the aspects of Niddah remain deeply compelling, despite the fact that there are difficulties, and the main challenges are basically technical. Mikvaot are inaccessible, they're only open at night, they're run by unfriendly attendants. There's a culture of secrecy, shame around immersion, and there's inadequate information about the practice of Niddah that leads people to adopt stringencies that the Shulchan Aruch never imagined. Those are problems, it is important to say, that are relatively easily fixed with sufficient communal will and investment, and there are many good folks in the Jewish world working on those issues right now. For others, the harchakot are the root of the problem. Abstinence works, makes sense, even enhances, but a total ban on touch and beyond threatens to create a bizarre and potentially hurtful dynamic that can eat away at a relationship from within. This problem is aggravated by the fact that married couples today are locked into a geographic and emotional isolation that is essentially unprecedented in human history. Instead of living in clans with larger webs of economic interdependence, couples are now expected to marry their best friends without the daily presence of a range of other relatives to support them through the trials of life. And in a world in which couples are incredibly emotionally codependent, a harsh regime of harchakot has negative implications of a scope, I submit to you, it never had in the past. Doesn't mean it didn't have implications, but they are of a scope now that is unprecedented. But we saw the ways in which the Maharam of Rothenburg chastised men who would not physically assist their sick wives during Niddah. And I played out the ways in which I think we must, despite the risks and despite the creativity of reapplication we've been talking about tonight, broaden and expand that sensitivity to need in both gender directions, to areas of mental and emotional isolation as well, and create the possibility of non-erotic touch that's consistent with the framework of sexual abstinence. For yet others, it's the pathologizing of the normal, the conflation of the normal and the pathological being conflated, Niddah and Zava, and the simple physical reality of extending from 7 to 12 days. That's the crux for many of you. And here a number of sources pointed the way to a reimagining of some of those practices. A number of Rishonim imagined the possibility of eliminating the 4 or 5 day waiting period at the start, either because this never applied to marital relations at all, or because bathing in hot water renders it superfluous. More dramatically, Responsa Beit Avi by Rav Yitzchak Isaac Liebes, who we did not get to see inside, opens up the possibility that it may be wiser to practice 7 days in a context in which 12 days will be impossible and tear the marriage and any sense of shared religious commitment apart. That element needs more work, but there are the beginnings of a conversation there in the sources. But even without shortening the period of abstinence, there are important ways of removing some of the pathology from its application. We saw this evening, sometimes one category is borrowed from another without applying all of the details. One can use the model of Zava to prevent snap marriages without needing to institute daily checks. That's what the Rashba said. And so argues the Niddah Yehuda about the normal series of 7 clean days, as it were, when he suggests that the stringency of Rabbi Zera was never intended to impose 7 days of internal checks on husband and wives, but rather to impose a 7-day waiting period in which female consciousness of the cessation of bleeding was sufficient. That is a source to be developed further for those who experience the pathological as unhealthily pronounced in the practice of bidikot. Moving on, we encounter those for whom the mikveh is not just a logistical challenge, but a major block in light of its preservation of elements of a world of Tumayin Tahara, in a world in which we no longer really apply those categories more broadly. And here I suggested that we have 2 main options. One is the revival of Tumayin Tahara in significant ways. We actually give the karet penalty and force until immersion more context by truly understanding women's immersion as taking custody of a practice that awaits further development and broader application. We might, for instance, encourage men with seminal emissions to go to the mikveh before prayer, especially before they take on the task of leading the community, a restriction that was in place for large swaths of Jewish history and remains so in many communities today. But alternatively, we recognize the serious strand in the conversation that detaches the penalty of karet from immersion and applies it only to the act of having sex during the 7-day period kicked off by menstruation. In this world, mikveh is maintained by many, and I would argue even should be, even if in a more egalitarian form, as a practice with deep roots in the Jewish past and with ongoing spiritual benefits, but its abandonment by others is not necessarily the end of commitment to sexual mores or respect for Vayikra 20, even as it may indicate a putting to rest of the issues raised by Vayikra 15. And as a way of softening the impact of this practice, we might question, in a depth we have not been able to do here, whether it is indeed so obvious that a full-body shower fails to meet the requirements set out in rabbinic sources for a valid immersion. Finally, for some, nothing short of the essential dismantling of this category accurately captures the gulf between our reality and the core sources, such that any application of anything we have learned must be so dramatically limited and changed as to be virtually unrecognizable to earlier practice. The radical possibilities exist here, albeit on the fringe elements of the conversation. The embrace of hargasha, female sensation, as the ultimate arbiter of biblical tum'ah, and the possibility that women simply no longer experience this. Combine this with Rav Avraham Av Beit Din's notion that ktamim, rabbinic level evidence of menstruation, no longer apply in a world without taharot, And you're essentially left with a legal picture where a man and a woman will only encounter a violation of Niddah if they actually encounter blood after the fact during the act of sex. This is not the place to work out all of those details, but suffice it to say that the rabbinic conversation around this topic, as with most topics, lays some groundwork for the topic's potential annihilation from within. But like most radical reads, one must ignore a great deal of wisdom that may emerge from the motivations we began with. What may be possible may not be persuasive, at least to many, nor may it be wise, perhaps, for any. I want to end by saying that the conversation here, I think, must continue. We clearly need, among other things, to seek out the experiences of women in the text and beyond the text to get fuller data on what is the way to move forward on this issue. Part of that data collection is an honest and frank appraisal of the fact that many Jewish women experience the entire practice of Niddah as one riddled with, quote, confusion, alienation, and shame, to use a phrase I borrow from one of you. Yet another piece, sometimes in conflict with the preceding, is the need to engage this topic not just as individuals, but as a broader Jewish collective. A collective not only of women of varied experience, but of men and women as well. That sort of collective conversation always requires some minimizing of individual experience as the sole driver of an individual's practice, even as one cannot allow a tyranny of the majority or the powerful to completely crush individual members of the covenantal community. The communal and even standardizing elements of any area of law and practice are, I think, a part of the essence of the project of Torah. Torah is not just the Jewish idiom for what is meaningful to me, even as God's love of every individual human being means that Torah must respond and react to life and be capable of virtually limitless possibilities of application in divergent contexts. And we need people to ask questions and to raise their own voices as they participate in the reimagination and the reapplication of this topic, described in the Mishnah as a guf Torah, literally the body of the Torah, part of the Torah's attempt to deal with the human body and with the sexuality with which it is endowed. Your voices all here have very much shaped my own thinking on the topic, and I offer myself, however useful it may be, to serve as an ongoing conversation partner in this regard, whether for practical questions or theoretical speculation. Perhaps more than with any other topic, the Torah needs us to contribute to the topic of Niddah so that we can say about it, as I hope we strive to say about all other parts of the Torah, Hadar Thank you all for coming. I want to hear it again. I'm not flat. Ready to talk.
Fair. I'll see you soon. All right, sounds good.
regular attendance. It's a real question for me. Okay, what is it? Forget about how we solve this problem.
I would hardly